Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen. I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, we got to take a look at something fascinating coming in the aftermath of the overthrow of the Syrian government. And that has to do with energy, threats of pipelines, and of course, what it means for the US, Europe, and the entire western part of the continent as a whole. Paul, is what I want to thank you as always for being a part of this great discussion. And what are your thoughts, especially as Trump comes out and makes demands of a tariff war if Europe doesn't start buying even more energy and LNG from the US?
Well, yeah, firstly, thanks, Ken, as well, for joining me today. Pleasure as always. Yeah, there's a lot of angles to this energy question, and they're pretty serious. Excuse me, whether it's for Europe, for what happens in West Asia, what happens to the United States. But first off, I want to make reference to Syria because there's long held been this belief, and there is some merit to it, by the way, that effectively the whole idea to overthrow Assad back in 2011 related to energy pipelines. And there is some truth to that, and merit to it. But keep in mind, this relates to a time when these discussions, in the looser sense of the word, by the way, there was no agreements. There was a discussion about this, which was to provide pipeline gas via Qatar through Saudi Arabia into Syria, into Turkey, and really to provide pipeline gas to the Europeans, which to really cut the Russians out the market effectively. That was a kind of not an object was an objective, but there was no actual firm commitment from anyone to do this. Now, let's fast forward to today. We know Assad's gone, and people immediately jumped to the conclusion that that would therefore mean these pipelines are going to be built. And we can actually categorically state why that is extremely unlikely. And there are a number of reasons. But firstly, you have to build this infrastructure. And with all due respect, the relations between the Saudis and the Qataris, whilst it's better than it was, because at one point, remember, the Saudis completely blockaded Qatar. Economically, they tried to destroy it because they regarded them as being a sponsor of state terrorism. And they, of course, subsequently relinquished the blockade, but relations are not great between the two nations still. So we have a situation where that would therefore mean they would have to sanction, and a huge percentage of the pipeline would have to be across Saudi territory for them to agree to do this. The other risk is because of how inflammatory Syria is and West Asia in general, the idea of putting gas pipelines in and the risk of them being attacked and destroyed is self-evident. That's another big consideration because putting these pipelines in is not going to be a cheap project. And another point worth making is, bearing in mind this was going back 18, 20 years ago, Qatar's desire to sell energy into the world markets is radically changed in that point in time. It sells an awful lot more to the Chinese, to West Asia, to the Europeans already. And therefore, the question is, how much more capacity would they have to sell the energy via pipelines, if assuming this was even put in place, which is highly questionable. And also because for Qatar, selling LNG is more profitable. But then this is ultimately the thing that you would argue the most significant reason why this will never happen. And that relates to the United States. And here's why. Because let's imagine everyone agrees to put these pipelines in, someone pays for it all, someone is able to provide a secure link between Qatar and European markets. Who's going to be the biggest loser in this? It's going to be the United States because, as you pointed out, Ken, excuse me, the US wants to force Europe's hand to buy even more LNG. Well, if this pipeline was ever to come into existence, Europe would buy all the LNG from Qatar and tell the Americans, we're not buying it from you because it's more expensive and Qatar's got more reliable markets and more reliable reserves. So the US would shoot itself in the foot. So this is not the reason why Assad's been overthrown this time around. It's far more complicated than that. But we're not here to discuss Syria today. But I thought that as a first point had to be made because there's these very sort of naive, simplistic perspectives. Well, this is what happened 20 years ago, so it applies today. Well, it doesn't for the reasons I've just stated, not least 20 years ago, what was the US as in terms of the global market supplying LNG to anyone? In terms of gas, it wasn't. So in reality, in relative terms, so the world's changed. The US is not going to allow something to happen that would cause will be monumentally disastrous for their own policy of trying to sell energy to Europe, who's going to go, thank you very much, Qatar, we'll buy the energy from you instead of the United States. You just know that's not going to happen.
Yeah, with Europe being the linchpin, obviously, Iran has its working with Russia to create the north-south corridor. I'm sure pipeline is going to facilitate into that. Syria, well, as I think you mentioned before, Iran and Russia have sort of been disconnecting themselves from Syria for a little while, so that wasn't really a big surprise. Qatar has been building LNG facilities to expand their ability to ship to new sources. And the problem with Europe is there was an article that just came out. More and more bankruptcies are occurring with German companies. I mean, it's just starting to escalate, if not get to exponential levels. So Europe as a whole is going deeper and deeper into recession. One, that means they're going to need less energy for business. Two, it goes back to a podcast we did, unless they start making agreements with, say, China to start getting investment in and to have more partnerships with China in regards to business, Europe is going to be left, holding the bag more and more. And the United States, what do they really have to export? Well, we've made the joke in the past that the only things that the U.S. exports is inflation and bad ideologies. But Trump seems to think that energy is the primary thing that the U.S. is going to expand upon and be the world leader in. And if Europe doesn't need as much, they're not going to be buying from there. The U.S. has to re-engineer because right now they don't have the facilities to export any more LNG. It's going to take 5 to 10 years just to be able to do that. The cost is going to increase, and well, Europe needs energy now. They don't need it 5 to 10 years from now. So they're going to make contracts with Qatar. And of course, once the Ukraine conflict comes to an end and the reality of all these sanctions start to go away, they'll probably turn and go back to Russia with their hat in hand begging, hey, can we, facilitate some type of reinstitution of energy policies? Yeah, they might have to pay a premium for it, but it's going to be far, far less than what the U.S. Charges Europe to ship LNG by cargo ship at a slow pace versus using the pipeline mechanisms.
Yeah, absolutely. And another point worth making that, I mean, Europe's reeling because you rightly point out in Germany and other European countries, their industry is struggling, to put it diplomatically. They're now at the risk in these winter months of having a huge hike in their gas prices. Why? Because we're in that heating season, as they refer to. So you deplete the stocks you have. They're also having to compete with Asia for LNG supplies because, again, the truth of the matter is the United States can't provide the energy they need. The US likes to think this, and Trump thinks they can just turn this tap on and produce more and more LNG. It's not true. And also, we now have the prospect of even more reduced Russian supplies. Why? Because they're effectively, the Ukrainians have come out and stated, as of December the 31st, we're cutting off the supply, the one last supply route through Ukraine. So there's this mad scramble for energy, which Europe, okay, you can argue to one extent doesn't need the same amount, from an industrial perspective, but it most certainly still needs it for domestic consumption. And if you look at since really the start of the Ukraine war, and it's over 2.5 years now, when it started, the Ukraine war, gas prices in Europe were about 350 euros per megawatt hour. We've seen this big, huge impact on European companies. They've closed factories. They've reduced jobs. Why? Because high energy prices have completely decimated their competitiveness. So many are really having increasingly reduced demand because the economies are cratering. There's lower manufacturing capability. And if you look at European Union gas demand, it's actually about 18% below the 5-year average that we saw during the pre-pandemic years, whereas gas prices are now at their highest level in over a year. And the expectation is that's only going to rise even higher because of, as we said, the end of the year, this Russian transit deal to supply gas via Ukraine will end. And if you look at it, European gas prices were as high as 70 euros per megawatt hour. Or the belief is that could happen next year, where currently they're 50. Now, the argument is, okay, they're nowhere near in the ballpark area we saw in 2022, but that could easily spike and get a lot higher, particularly because European gas reserves are depleting quite rapidly. And they're going to have to replace them. But if you look as an average price, even now, they're about 3 times higher than what we saw before the pandemic. And that also sort of ties in with the start of the Ukraine war. But if you look at European gas inventories, they're at about 82%. They're over 10% lower than a year ago, like for like period. And and they're below the 5-year average currently, gas storage facilities, and European companies are going to have to pay electricity prices multiple times higher than those in the United States. And natural gas prices are even more multiples higher than. And Europe's having to deal with this. And basically, Germany's come out and said, look, all these higher energy prices are threatening the competitiveness of our economy. And if you look in France, which is the second biggest economy in Europe, they're expected to operate as low as 65% of capacity this winter due to higher energy prices. So, you can see how every European country is going to be impacted by this. And in real terms, compared to a year ago, European storage levels are at least 10 to 12 billion cubic meters lower. And the problem with LNG is it's very competitive markets. So if you want to outbid, say, China or some country in Asia, you're going to have to pay even more because that's how it works. It's okay, there's long-term contracts that countries have signed, but Europe doesn't have these because it didn't want to sign long-term contracts like the Germans should have done with Qatar. They refused to do so. Qatar said, well, we're not signing the deal then. So they're having to buy in the open markets. And also, if they suddenly require significantly more, not just cutting the supply via Ukraine, then the price increase is going to be, multiples higher than current multiples. And therefore, this is just a recipe for a complete disaster because, again, they didn't think this through sensibly. They just went for the ideological angle. Let's teach Russia a lesson. Well, they're teaching themselves an extremely painful lesson. And if we have rest of the winter is extremely cold, for argument's sake, you could find by springtime that the gas reserves are extremely low and they're not going to be able to easily fill them up again for next winter. And okay, there is less demand in terms of from an industrial capacity, but that is very bad for the economy. It's very bad for the broader financial system. And if businesses continue to be eroded and Europe effectively collapses economically, then you might say, oh, well, energy prices is less of an issue because we don't need to import so much energy. But we all know what an absolute disaster it would be for Europe if their entire industrial base and their economies were gutted, not least and not entirely be due to energy costs, and more importantly, the lack of access to such energy.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things I pay attention to, not every day, but I do, especially since the conflict has been kicking in, and as well as when Russia became OPEC plus, is the West Asian markets and indexes when it comes to oil, natural gas, etc., as compared to the standard benchmarks of Brent crude and WTI. And going into the weekend, Murban crude, the OPEC basket, the Dubai, and Oman, every single one of them were below the Brent crude price. And to me, what that really says is that the costs of being able to produce and to even function on the Western markets, whether it's London and Brent or Chicago with WTI, these costs are accelerating. And in both instances, there's no pipelines really to send. They've got to ship that out. Whereas the Middle East, West Asia, has these pipeline facilities, and of course, they also have cheaper production. So I think we're going to see more and more where the global pricing is going to move into West Asia and replace both Brent and WTI as the primary standard. And if that's the case, then the US can try to produce and ship as much as they want. They're not going to be able to compete with what's being put in right now. Syria is going to have perhaps some ties to that, but as primarily you said, Qatar, Russia, which is part of OPEC plus, Oman, Saudi Arabia, they're already moving forward and progressing to create these facilities and the methods of distribution that the U.S., which relies upon ships to carry their oil, are just not going to be able to compete, especially when it comes to LNG. That's, in large part why their prices are so much higher than Qatar.
Yeah, it's a very important point. We're starting to see energy deals signed between global south countries, and they're not going to be priced based on Brent or WTI, but places like Dubai, for example, or China's now wanting to increasingly have energy that's priced based on Shanghai, and you will see more and more energy priced based on these different exchanges, and the West is going to lose a grip on those exchanges as a consequence, both for oil and for gas. And this is a huge additional problem that the West is going to suffer from. Now, for people who are buyers, provided, of course, we're back to the availability of this energy, this is a huge problem. But in terms of the supply, they might be able to ultimately source, if they can, the supply at a cheaper price than the US can provide. But they've also got to understand the US doesn't have the kind of resources in oil and gas that Russia has. I've said this before and people really don't believe this, but then, we've said things for longer than I care to remember that no one believed. And then eventually it becomes common knowledge. But Russia could probably provide most of the world's energy needs and its own for the next 200 years. And Iran has enormous energy reserves as well in the process. So there is plenty of energy, but from the West perspective, they're in the wrong parts of the world for ideological reasons because they're vassal states of the United States. But the idea of the United States is going to be able to continue to provide cheap energy to the rest of the world for decades and longer to come is not a realistic proposition. And already it looks as though the US is peaking in terms of its shale oil and shale gas. Some people will argue to the contrary. In the next 5 to 10 years will absolutely definitively prove that, maybe even less, if there is a sharp fall off. But the United States is not a long-term prospect. And I think, and I might be wrong, and I could be putting words in Trump's mouth, but I get the feeling he thinks the US is this bottomless pit of energy. And if that were true, then fine, the US could sell a lot of energy into the marketplace, potentially. But it absolutely appears that that is not the case. And at some point, the question is, when does the United States have to start going out of, and apart from buying heavy oil, which it needs to produce diesel, which it principally gets from Russia, it might be in a situation in the future where it has to import even more energy. Who's it going to import the energy from? And this then comes back to the fact of, this desire to balkanize Russia and try and seize control of its energy, because and it'll never happen, but if the US was to seize control of Russia's asset and Russia's energy, then the United States would hands down be an hegemonic power again, because it would dictate and control energy markets. But it doesn't. And the point is, the Russians do, the West Asia does, including the Iranians. They're the ones that have the capability to, and also dictate prices and sell energy to the global South countries at very affordable prices and still make a significant profit. So what this indicates is there is this big shift in energy markets. The world isn't what it was 10, 20 years ago. So we need to be extremely careful in looking at historical context to provide any understanding of what's currently going on today.
Exactly. Because if you go back, the old saying, all roads lead to Rome. Well, it was the ability to traverse easily that made Rome one of the most powerful in Europe for a while. In the old saying that them that has the gold makes the rules. Well, gold doesn't have the standing that it did way in the past, but energy is the lifeblood of everything. And those who have the ability to put that cheap energy and to produce it in quantity, they're the ones who really rule the world today. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this great discussion and for your insight.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report Plus community, thank you for all of your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.